Welcome to Human Resource Management, Lecture 5. Today we're going to be discussing unions and unionization. Over the next couple of lectures, we'll be looking at unions and what we refer to as industrial relations. So if you hear me say industrial relations, I'm really talking about unions, or if I talk about unions, industrial relations, same thing, potato, potato. Same idea. And we'll talk a little bit about the historical aspects of how unions evolved. They really originated out of what we call the craft guilds, and you still see the remnants of that today in our apprenticeship systems. Craft guilds were groupings of specialized crafts, trades we'd probably call it today, that were brought together so that people could learn and master a trade. It also was a form of power in the sense that the craft guilds kind of protected their trades. They ensured that people weren't doing things without having gone through an apprenticeship, and that also limited the amount of people that would be in the marketplace doing that particular trade. So if you have, a few masters at something and they're limiting how many apprentices they take on, that's kind of limiting the workforce. That means that you can typically, going back to Adam Smith with supply and demand, you can limit the supply, and if the demand is high enough, then you can make a very good living. And back then, it was very prestigious to be taken on as an apprentice and been included in a guild. The process involved being accepted by a master journey person, and that would be somebody that's mastered that particular skill. If you were brought on, you probably did the most menial, difficult type of work for a number of years, and slowly the master would let you do more things and teach you how to do certain things, and over time you would become what they called a journey person. And a journey person, its roots in the word journey, related to that once you reached a certain skill set, you would actually travel to different towns and locations and build up on those skill sets until you were deemed to be a master at that craft. And then you could start your own business. So there was a real process to it, and a real pride in the workmanship. The great cathedrals that you see around Europe and some of the surviving architecture, you can see a lot of the work that came out and through craft guilds. And a lot of Europe still has a great pride in their apprenticeship systems. Germany has an excellent apprenticeship system. And in North America, we have apprenticeship systems for trades. In Ontario, we have a certificate of qualification, which is deemed by the government of Ontario. And most of the trades in that are what they would call Red Seal, which means they're good for the rest of Canada. So the process is there. You typically have to work for somebody as an apprentice a few years, and it's generally by an hour system. And once you reach a certain amount of hours, depending on the trade, usually somewhere between 4 and 5 years, maybe say somewhere between 7 and 10,000 hours. Once you've reached that point, then you can write an exam. And if you're successful on the exam, then you're deemed to have that trade. In between that time, there's periods of schooling that you do. And usually the schooling's either provided by a union or a college that provides the training. And the training's developed with advisory committees and employers, and to ensure that the training covers what's required for today. So it's a real process that's in place. And what happened was with craft guilds is some crafts, they kind of struggled in the sense that the Industrial Revolution came along. And with the Industrial Revolution, mechanization of a lot of elements of a craft, there was a lot of de-skilling that took place. So some crafts were de-skilled to the point that they were very specialized works, so something that a craft person would do. Going back to Adam Smith, you have somebody that made a pin from start to finish, but they didn't make very many of them. But if you could break it down and use mechanization to improve the process, you could get a lot done, and you could control quality as well and manage quality. That meant that those trades were no longer as valuable. And if they're no longer as valuable, then people that were in those trades had to go looking for work. So very often that meant a huge drop in salary, and usually a big draw to urban centers from more rural areas. So when I talk about this and you think about it, and especially those of you from developing countries, you can probably see it happening even today, right? So you see a lot of movement from rural areas to urban centers, and a lot more people working in factories and that sort of thing, which changes sort of the landscape, changes the job market, changes the pay structure. And of course, when you're drawn into urban areas, they tend to be more expensive if you want to live in those urban areas, which puts a lot of pressure on people when they're getting paid less and they need to make more to survive. So there was a lot of that process that went into things, and it was very competitive marketplace. The result was there was very little consideration for workers. So, you're working in a factory and there was not much in the way of safety. You were expected to work 7 days a week, 9 hours a day, 10 hours a day, long hours, exhausting. You really didn't have much of a life. So that you can understand that there would be a pushback to that. And even families had to have their children work, which was making things even more complicated because you wanted to be able to pay your rent and get food. And so there was child labor. And there were no rules or government regulations to make sure that children were protected, to make sure that people were protected from a safety perspective. So really, when we talk about balance of power, the balance of power was really with the business owners. And they could even get support from the police if somebody was acting out of line or they were trying to organize people to protest. Generally speaking, governments would protect the business owners. So that put a real kind of balance of power problem into effect. And typically, many businesses took advantage of their employees. They paid them low. They expected way too much. They could shift somebody in and out very quickly if they didn't do exactly what they wanted, because there was lots of people that were seeking work at that time because there was lots of change and transition of jobs going on. So it was kind of a time of upheaval that really affected people, their way of living. And so there was a lot of disruption. And out of those roots, unions started to form to try to, how are we going to be able to push back? Individually, you against a boss who has a lot of power, you're not going to be able to do too much. But as a group, all of the workers in the company being able to protest, being able to go on strike, being able to stop work, now you've got some influence. Now you've got some power. And of course, there wasn't regulations for unions. It came out of nowhere. It's kind of like when a new industry pops up out of nowhere and we don't have regulations on how to handle it. Think Uber as an example. So it was really, as I mentioned, a time of upheaval where workers had to struggle. And you can still see this today where some developing countries have these same issues, right? They maybe don't have the regulations in place. Could be political process, could be government problems or government not willing to let individuals have more rights or powers. There's a lot of reasons for it, but we definitely see this still today in some developing countries. These pictures from the 1800s are showing child labor, working on machines, etc., and not very safe conditions. And sometimes it takes some big events for there to be sort of a massive change. It's almost like you have this buildup, nothing seems to change, things stay the same, but there's this underlying resentment that's going on, and there's this underlying desire to have change take place. And sometimes you have an event like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York City, where Many people, 146 people, perished in the fire. Why did they perish in the fire? Because the fire doors were chained shut so that people wouldn't go on to the fire escape and have a smoke. And of course, probably meant that somebody smoked inside, and the linens caught fire, the textiles caught fire really rapidly, and people couldn't get out. So they ended up, many of them, perishing, jumping to their deaths from the windows. After that, it really inflamed a lot of people, and the International Ladies Garment Union fought for improved sweatshop workers' rights and conditions. After that, New York probably had the best fire regulations in the world for that time. Before that, they probably had one of the worst. So you can see how quickly things can evolve and change, because it just brings horror to people, and they don't want to see that kind of tragedy again. So in some ways, something really bad can result in something good and save many more lives over time. And early 1900s was a very big time of conflict that went on because there was such rapid change taking place. And we mentioned Fordism in the last lecture and Taylorism in the last lecture. And Ford actually hired people at a very high rate of pay. So actually, Ford's idea was to pay very well for the time period. But over time, the work conditions still weren't very good. And if as I mentioned in the last lecture, if you take a look at the Fordism videos, the Rouge River plant videos of the time, and you see people putting together spokes on machines and different things like that, it looks very dangerous. Your mind wanders for a second, and you're going to lose a hand. And also, you can see the stress and the pressure of just all day long doing that, and people with stopwatches if you had to go to the washroom, so to speak. So there definitely was opportunity there for improvement, and unions were the vehicle for that. So we really can think of unions and industrial relations as being sort of a catalyst to improve work conditions. We think about, when I say it, employer is usually referred to as management, and then you have the union, and union members typically call themselves brothers and sisters. It's a brotherhood or a sisterhood of members, and they're trying to make it that we're a family and we work together to get better working conditions against management. So it kind of sets itself historically up as being something that's, for the most part, adversarial. It's not always that adversarial, but very often it can be. And a lot of it also depends on the history and the relationship between the membership that has occurred over time. So the reason that the union is able to carry out its role is because it's legal, it's legislated. They have a right to unionize in Canada. And there's provincial and national legislation that helps in that arena to ensure that employees can unionize and that they can work together to protect their rights. So this is at the foundation of how unions really evolved and how they presented themselves to employees to have a real solid purpose from that perspective. Out of the roots of history, this is how unions became into being. So the other thing I would also say is that some people would say, well, unions have kind of served their time. Well, unions did a lot as far as upping overall standards in Canada, just regular standards for non-unionized employees. And we'll talk about that in the next few slides. So without, even whether you're pro-union or anti-union, because everybody kind of has views or neutral on it, it's good to understand the history of it and where it evolved and where the balance of power was, and then you can also think about where the balance of power currently is and how it shifts and changes with different economic conditions. If we look at Canada today, there is around, and I'm using the stats from 2015. Stats Canada usually releases their data every 5 years, so this is the most recent data that I have. It might be out now, given that it's just 5 years, but it's around 30%. So I don't think it's changed drastically in the last 5 years. There's been a overall trend over the last 20 years or so downward. So 20 years ago, it might have been around 36%, if I recall, 37%. There has been a downward trend, but I think over the last few years it's kind of stabilized in Canada. In the US, it's lower. So in the US, it's lower. Government employees typically are unionized in Canada, so that's a big swath right there. Construction employees are very often unionized, and manufacturing is very often unionized. Service sector, not so much. So we know we have a lot of people work in the service sector, so typically not as much as the other sectors. Doesn't mean it's not there, it's just not as often as you might think it would be. So I'll see if I can, I think I've got a PDF file that I downloaded that I can put up onto Quarkus regarding some of the stats that I pulled out 2015. I'll also do a check and see if there's something a little bit more recent. But definitely that's a big part of it. And of that big part, the majority of unionized workers are represented by national unions. So the difference between a provincial union and a national union is a union that goes right across the country. So we've got national, international, independent, local, directly chartered. There's different sort of levels of unionization. An example of an international union might be, I'll think of Laborers International Union of North America. So in the construction sector, I think in Ontario there's around 40 or 50,000 members of the Laborers International Union of North America. And their head office is in the United States, and then they have locals up here. So there is that affiliation and connection there. So that'd be an example of an international union. National would be something that would be across Canada. One that would be provincial, good example probably would be OPSEU, Ontario Public Service Employees Union. So it focuses in on a lot of government businesses that are in the province of Ontario. Usually provincial government, colleges, universities, those types of things. Share of unions by organization type. Again, this is just looking at almost 95% of unionized workers, so national and international unions represented almost 95% of unionized workers, but accounted for 30.5% of the total number of unions, right? Directly chartered locals and independent and organizations made up the majority of unions, 69.6%. So that now you're just talking about how many unions there are. There's definitely, even like with businesses, how a business can acquire other businesses, and then they can have more control, more influence, economies of scale. There's definite economies of scale with unions. They can lower costs when they're a bigger union. They also have more power. They can lobby governments more easily because they'll have a bigger base of cash to draw from, because they will collect money from their membership, which would be all the employees. So a union that has 500,000 members is going to have a lot more power and influence than a union that has 500 members. So there's those distinctions that can be made. So that's why you'll see a lot of times when a group of employees wants to unionize, they don't create their own new union. They go with an existing union more frequently for those reasons. Not that they can't, they can definitely form their own union, but you don't see that as frequently these days. Just this appendix here, unionized workers, all employees. I'll just put my glasses on for a second here. There we go. So unionized workers, so just giving a sense of in the hundreds, add 3 zeros to that. So you could see unionized workers, 4,828,000. So this is coming down to the percentages that there are. It's grown, but as a percentage, it's dropped, as I was saying. I think I said 37% earlier. It's actually, I guess it's 34%. So it has dropped percentage-wise. And the reason it's increasing number-wise, well, how much has Canada grown in that period of time? Quite significantly. So Numbers-wise, it is increasing, but percentage of population-wise, there's been a decrease. So member numbers based on type of union. So national, so you can sort of get a sense of the number of national unions that we have, independent local ones, and of course, because they are small, independent local ones, there's a lot of them, but they don't really make up a big portion of the overall membership. Most of your memberships are coming in these kind of unions, right? So just think of this and this. And under this category, I think when they say national, there's two types of national. There's national with how the laws regulate it, and then there's just national big unions. And I think they're including just even large provincial unions within that. So some of the labor and labor relations laws, federal, provincial legislation. If a business works across provinces, then federal legislation governs, as I was mentioning. And if a business works only in one province, then the provincial legislation governs. So it depends also on the province. Like some provinces are more union friendly, like I mentioned with the United States, and others maybe a little bit less so. I think probably Ontario and Quebec are pretty union friendly overall, and I think Alberta probably not so much. I think Manitoba is probably pretty union friendly given their history and background. Tommy Douglas, was one of the founders of unions in Canada and the NDP party, that sort of thing. So there's quite a background in coming out of Manitoba that way. Labor relations laws, some basic points, and again, this can vary by province, but this is very typical. The establishment of procedures to legally recognize the union as the workplace representative for employees, known as certification. So when a union gets certified, that means it now has the right to represent those employees. And typically when there's a collective agreement, that's the contract between the union and the employer. When a contract is to be negotiated, usually there's a minimum of a year. You don't want to be negotiating a contract every 6 months. It's very disruptive. And to be honest, most unions and most employers, they want to try to negotiate a 3 or 4 year term because it provides stability for that period of time. Both parties know this is what we're going to be following. There's not the likelihood of disruption with a strike to happen. So usually you'll find those will try to negotiate longer terms. The exceptions usually are when the economy is very volatile, we don't know what's going to go on. If there's a lot of inflation, then sometimes either the employer or the employees will want a shorter term, but not less than a year. The establishment of procedures that must be followed. So the legislation will be very clear on what the process is for a strike or lockout to occur. A strike is when the employees say they're not coming into work because they're not happy with the conditions and their contract is up. A lockout is when the employer says we're not letting you into work, contract is up, so we are not allowing you to work till we settle this. One side or the other side is trying to put pressure on each other. That's a real important aspect of the negotiation process, unfortunately, but that it does seem to be the requirement to get things going very often, kickstart things. So we have that. The establishment of the procedures to resolve disputes while agreements are in place. So it's just basically is the agreement being followed? There's always going to be disputes where one side feels the other side's not following the contract. So in that case, there's usually some sort of grievance resolution procedure. And a grievance is where an employee feels that they've not been represented properly by their employer. So that employee will go to their union representative, usually called a shop steward, to file a grievance. And then usually there's a process. So whatever that process is that's been agreed to in the collective agreement, the contract, which has been outlined what it has to be in the provincial legislation, usually without too much detail because they want to leave the parties to have some latitude to work out the details. They will file a grievance, and then usually there's a meeting with the direct boss, the employee, and the steward. The union representative is with them during this meeting to make sure that they're fairly represented and they're not threatened, etc. And hopefully it's agreed upon at that point. If it's not, then there might be a further meeting, and that might involve people from HR, the manager, the union steward, maybe the union president or the local president, and hopefully there's an agreement there. If there's not an agreement there, then it might go to arbitration, binding arbitration, and that's where you will have a arbitrator. Very often you might have 3 arbitrators, one arbitrator selected at random and one that was selected by each of the parties, and then they hear the case and then they make a decision, and then it's binding. This is what you follow. So that's a typical process. It's not the process. You might have mediation steps in between that, because arbitration, quite honestly, is quite an expensive process. It's like almost going through the court system. So you can think of it in those terms, but it can be quite the process, so to speak. Usually the definition of legal behavior by the union management in situations such as a campaign for certification. So what is the legal behavior? How can they act or not act? There's a lot of laws in place, particularly like in Ontario, that aspect. If a group wants to unionize, it shouldn't be that their employer just shuts down that store and says, if they've voted to certify, and then the company just shuts down that store because we don't want to have the union in any of our stores, that would be treated, at least in Ontario, as being against the regulatory requirements, and there could be punitive actions by the government to the employer. Does that mean it doesn't happen? I would say no. You can read up on your own. Some of you may find when you do your major projects that you'll find certain companies have sort of a little bit of a reputation that way. Some people would accuse Walmart of having done that a few times in different locations, and you can read up on that. And there's always these nuances with the laws that companies may find some avenues for loopholes, etc. And there's valid reasons why some companies maybe don't want to unionize. As you can sort of see, it kind of restricts their ability to run their business in many ways. But at the same time, there's if people that are working within those companies have felt that they could get a better sort of representation with a union, there's a good likelihood that they may vote for it. So there's a lot to it, and it's a good way of looking at how the company works overall. If you're going to work for a company, it's good to sort of look at the history of the company, because some companies work very, very well with their unions, and they kind of actually have a very positive sort of non-adversarial relationship, while others, it's very adversarial from the get-go, and there's lots of strikes in their history and that sort of thing, and it kind of sets up this culture. We talked about cultures where there is them against us, which is kind of hard to run a really productive business when you've got some of those issues going on. So steps in the organizing campaign, usually employees decide to form a new union or to join an existing one, or the union contacts dissatisfied employees. As I said, unions are like businesses. They want to expand, so they go looking for non-unionized companies that are probably ripe to unionize. By ripe, I mean where you got disgruntled employees. So, if Tesla, a new company, is not unionized and they have enough disgruntled employees, you can be pretty sure that the different unions that represent the auto workers would be approaching different ways of approaching, trying to see if they can actually unionize. So that's usually the low-hanging fruit for them. If you have somebody that's disorganized and you have a company that's becoming quite successful, and there's a dichotomy between what the employees are getting and what the company is making, you can see that there's probably an opportunity for unions there. Not necessarily saying they're going to be successful. It also depends, as I said, where are they located, which state, how easy is it to unionize in that state. That's has a factor as to where a company might decide to build a new plant. Or unfortunately too, as has been the case over the last 30, 40 years, if a company feels that the legislation is too prohibitive and looks like they're going to unionize, that company has the ability to pull up stakes and maybe manufacture in another country at a lower cost, and then have their product shipped back to that country, to their native country. So it can cause a lot of animosity in a lot of different ways. And you can study the aspects of free trade and globalization and all of those factors, but there's a lot of politics involved, as we talked about in the first class with the external environment, and it plays into a lot of areas: political, legislative, regulatory, geographic, technological, a number of factors. They all come kind of converging in different ways as to, should we relocate or should we stay where we are? Robert Hoxie, an economist, he identified the actions that unions undertook to serve their members' interests. I kind of like this sort of framework that Hoxie came up with, and I think there still is a lot of truth in it today. With the framework. And I've kind of told you that frameworks or mental models can be helpful in just sorting out and getting a sense for things and how it works. So he believed that by understanding why a union acted as it did, it was important to understand what type of union it was. And so he's categorized them. So a business union, that would be like, it's specific to a particular business. So probably ones that I think about that way would be like the plumbers union, the electrical union, the laborers international union, North America I mentioned earlier. They represent a specific type of worker, and really they're trying to better that specific type of worker. They're not necessarily beyond that. They're just really trying to help the conditions, help the pay structure, help the job security for the electrician or the plumber, whatever they specifically are. Then, so that's pretty specific, so you can see the specialization. Uplifting or friendly unionism, they're actually trying to up everybody's conditions. So they have a mix of different representations. It's not just a plumber. It's not just, it could be administrative workers in a government job, which could be a whole bunch of different levels, or a wide basket of members that it's serving, maybe in a urban environment where you maybe have garbage collectors, childcare workers, admin assistants. You could list a whole maybe 15, 20 different trades or job descriptions, and they're representing them all. And what they're usually trying to do, because there's such a dichotomy, they're also trying to raise the standards of everybody. So it's kind of like high tide floats all boats. If we can get everybody's standards up, then that helps us keep our standards even higher. You know what? It's easier to negotiate, for a union to negotiate a $17 pay when minimum wage is $15, right? It's harder to negotiate $17 pay in like an area where it doesn't require a lot of skill if the minimum wage is $10. But it's much easier if it's $15. So there's a lot of opportunities there. And they've been successful. So friendly unionism, over the last 50, 60 years has had a huge influence. They spend a lot of time negotiating, lobbying governments to raise. There's a good example, was the minimum wage, have Canada pension plan, all of these aspects, a lot of push and support from unions, and you'll generally find certain governments in Canada are more supportive than other governments that way. And even like with parties, but even some parties, it just depends who the leader is, and it can just depend on that, right? So definitely the uplifting or friendly is more about trying to lift all the conditions. So just think the high tide will float all boats. Then there's the revolutionary unionism, attempt change through large-scale political action, attempt change through sabotage or violence, focused on long-term goal of changing the class structure, short-term goal of gaining power for the workers. So probably one of the best, there's a few examples there, but probably one of the best ones I can think of was Solidarity and Lech Walesa from Poland. That was in the early 1980s. And so you got a guy that was forming a union, Solidarity, pushing the government at that time, a communist government, being thrown in jail, being very successful at getting the changes that they wanted, eventually becoming the head of the country, and through election processes, democratic processes. So that would be a very, very good example of revolutionary unionism. And I know today when I mention this in an actual live class, when I mention Lech Walesa, Poland, Solidarity Union, I get a lot of blank stares like nobody has heard of him. And that's definitely too bad. So I definitely, if I were you, maybe take a few minutes and look that up on Wikipedia or Google that and look for some reasonably decent sources and take a good look at it, and you'll see that quite the history there, and that would definitely be the revolutionary unionism. And they weren't really violent. Like, it doesn't have to be through violence or sabotage. That can occur, obviously. That wasn't necessarily their story, but they were more beat on, I think, themselves by the government. So take a look at that, and you'll see how that went through the process. So that would be, I think, a good example of Hoxie's revolutionary unionism. Predatory unionism, too. You know, unions aren't perfect. They don't have a perfect history, that's for sure. So probably the best example of that is the Teamsters Union and Jimmy Hoffa. There's just recently was I think it was Netflix. Who was it? It was De Niro and basically Robert De Niro, and he was playing Jimmy Hoffa. And Jimmy Hoffa was the head of the Teamsters Union. This is in the 1960s and early 1970s. Not the most straight up person. There was involvement with the mafia, and when the mafia thought that he was going to squeal on them, he just disappeared. So nobody knows whatever happened to him, but he disappeared. So that was a predatory union, stealing money from workers' pension plans and redistributing it. A lot of issues there with a predatory union. I don't think you see too much of that go on today because there's so much regulatory requirements, at least in Canada. Doesn't mean it's not there, though. It still can be there in some cases, but it's more difficult to do. And usually at some point then there's arrests and somebody is put in that is more honest that the members decide to put into place. So the members have the voting power to put in who's leading it, the union, etc. And so that may be a little bit less of a problem issue, predatory unionism. But it was around, and there's still some examples. And maybe some of you that are from other countries may see it more predominant. It was definitely very predominant in North America in the onset of unionization. There's always somebody trying to take advantage of certain situations where that can occur. So why would you join a union? That's another question that comes up. And so usually the main reason for joining a union is to reduce workers' frustration, their anxiety. If they believe that they can get better conditions, prove their opportunity to achieve specific standards of living, then you probably have a high likelihood that they'll do it. If they're concerned, though, that the company's going to close down, move to a different country, offshore, or maybe Mexico if there's better opportunities there, then those workers might not vote for the union, because then that puts them at a disadvantage. So remember, we talked about that balance of power. Well, going back 40, 50 years, it really wasn't a choice to go to another country and set up shop. Whereas today, the last 30, 40 years, it's been more of an opportunity, say since about the 1980s. It's been more of an opportunity if a company wanted to move. But it's still a big decision, because you've got other things you got to deal with, currency rates and different regulatory requirements, and it's a big expense to move. And today there's a lot more opportunities with mechanization, depending on what you're doing. But if it's manufacturing and artificial intelligence and all of those types of things, that your labor base maybe isn't as saving as much as it was even 20 years ago. So there's a lot of things going on in this area and a lot of change taking place. But if I'm a company, I have to be concerned, am I setting the right conditions, the right culture, the right benefits, the right wage structure, that I can be sustainable as a business, profitable as a business, and at the same time have a happy, engaged group of employees. So you're starting to see there's a lot of little balls in the air that we're trying to balance here with all of these elements. And you're starting to think that human resource management is a lot more integrated than perhaps before you started taking this course. So there's a number of reasons. Social status, what is our income? Where are we on Maslow's hierarchy of needs that we were mentioning? So how important is this to us this way? In this particular environment, how are unions viewed? Again, as I said, some states they're viewed very positively, others they're not so much. And if you keep hearing it as you're growing up, that it's positive or it's negative, then you kind of formulate certain views. And one view might be more predominant than another. So one view might be more positive, say in Michigan, than it might be in, say, Georgia, as examples. Habits, norms. So what is the norm? If we're in an area that there's a lot of unions and it's very normal and this is what we do, and if our parents were part of this company and part of this union and we grew up with that, that has an impact on us too. You might join a union because you feel that you might have a stronger sense of control, influence, whereas right now you might not feel that you do. You might feel that you'll get more information. You might feel that there is a more positive affiliation by belonging, and that you'll have more integrity in the process. You might be more proud to be a union member. So there's a lot of factors that go into why somebody might join a union. So why would you care about unions? Well, one, it's pretty high in manufacturing. This is a class of engineering students. So if you're in aeronautics or in transportation, cars, design, if you're in any of those kind of sectors, or if you're in construction, usually get a lot of construction-related, civil-related students. You might be in a management position or not in a unionized position, but then you're dealing with people that are working in unions. So you should really look at, well, what are the contract requirements? What can we do? What can't we do? What flexibility, what latitude do we have? What are the pay implications? You're managing a large project and you're asking people to work overtime. What can you ask? What can't you ask? A whole bunch of factors that would come in. Government participation for non-management employees is high. So governments are very highly unionized when they're not management. As I said, it's somewhat downward, but not, as you saw from those stats, they weren't too significantly downward. And I would say it's actually slowing down a little bit that way. Collective bargaining benefits, a lot of spin-off benefits to the non-unionized sector. Even if I'm in the non-unionized sector, even if you're sitting there and you're like, I have no interest in unions, you know what? You benefit from unions, because whatever job rate that you're getting. So if you were in a trade, as an example, a non-unionized carpenter, maybe they're getting $28 an hour, maybe they're getting $32 an hour or $30 an hour, and unionized carpenters getting $38 an hour. You know what? You wouldn't even be getting $30 an hour if it wasn't for the unions getting 38. There's a difference, but your boss also knows if it's too big a difference and you're pretty good, you're going to go to the unionized sector. So to keep you, they keep it fairly close. And maybe that means you don't have to worry about strikes, and they treat you pretty well in this smaller company. So you like it, and you see the benefits of that. So that definitely has raised the stakes in a lot of jobs, and it's sort of the same idea of the high tide floats all boats. As economic changes continue change or vary, it puts various pressures, and people can shift. Can shift from unions, employers, and to employees, vice versa. So what do I mean by that? In a recession, there's usually, you read the newspapers in a recession, you'll hear a lot about unions. So the 2008 financial crisis. You heard a lot about the automakers unions, and some of the problems with was GM and Chrysler in particular, because they got government bailouts. So here we were told that they're too big to fail. Too big to fail. Well, what exactly does too big to fail mean? Well, it means they're getting tax dollars to stay supported so that all these loss of jobs doesn't too negatively hit the economy. And they also know that if this company goes bankrupt, because it's so hard to start an automotive company, that it likely won't come back. So they want to try to keep it, so they support it during that process. Well, then anybody who's in the non-unionized sector are like, well, why is my tax money saving these unionized workers when I just lost my job and I'm non-union? They're very upset about that. And so usually you get a lot of media, and that can actually have a negative impact on unions during those time periods. Conversely, when things are booming, people really don't care, because both the non-union sector and the union sector is doing so well, and the unionized sector can negotiate really, really good deals during boom times with their employers, because they're making so much profit. They don't want to shut things down with a strike, because then that's foregoing that profit. But often they regret that they signed off on that contract afterwards when the economy goes into a recession. And so that's kind of the buyer's remorse, so to speak, that goes on later on, because we have these economic cycles that we have to deal with, particularly in areas like manufacturing and construction. So definitely you should care about unions. They have a lot of impacts, whether you're unionized or you're not unionized. They can have impacts on you, whether, if it's the TTC and they're on strike. That means that you can't get a bus or a subway during that time period. So certain services are deemed to be essential services, and certain services are non-essential services. It's always a debate with public transportation that it's an essential service, but very often it's not deemed as an essential service. So we end up with a strike for a few days before government ends up putting in binding legislation for arbitration or what have you, and forces the workers back to work, legislates them back to work. Employee benefits to being a union. So some of the employee benefits to belonging to a union: wages and benefits are higher on average, especially for the less educated. As discussed, a union will benefit other non-union workers in the same field. Pretty much these items that I've talked about. Seniority is typically much more important for those with seniority. So really, if you were hired one day ahead of somebody else, so say you were hired 20 years ago, and you have 20 years seniority, and the other person has 21 years, 364 days, you would have seniority. Doesn't matter if the other person does twice the work you do, you would have seniority. So they would let go the other person, not you, which bothers employers in a lot of ways. Turnover is less in a unionized environment. Usually unionized employees, there is that aspect. The longer you're there, the more likely you're to stay there. You've got a really well-developed pension plan. It makes it very difficult to leave. Usually on the pay structure, there's different levels, and you've been scaled up over those levels over time. And actually, one of the interesting things is that union employees typically aren't as happy. I think that comes up on another slide, either this lecture or the next lecture. But there's less turnover, so the retention is higher. So even though if you poll the most unionized employees, they actually rate less happiness than the non-unionized employee. That's kind of seems counterintuitive, but I think the big reason for that in there is that they're less satisfied because they know they can get more. They know they can negotiate more. They know they have the ability to perhaps get more, whereas the individual employees sometimes don't feel they have that power or ability. So they don't worry about it. Doesn't bother them as much. Safer working conditions. You just have to look at WSIB, Workers' Safety Insurance Board, rates in the construction sector as an example. The unionized employers typically have much lower rates of accidents. Unions do a very good job of training their employees on safety. They collect training funds from their employees. They offer all kinds of training for their employees. They make sure they're properly represented to the employers above and beyond what the minimum regulatory requirements are. So typically that's much higher, and employees feel much more secure in their right to refusal of work if they deem it to be unsafe than, say, a typical non-union employee might feel. So that's that lower job satisfaction. I knew it was coming up sooner or later. But as I said, I think overall it's just because they have more influence in there. In the average strike, workers probably lose more in wages and benefits from their employer than they gain back. But the next time they negotiate, they're negotiating from a higher point. So that could also lifetime mean that it definitely works in their favor if there's only a few strikes here or there. Some employees in some sectors can actually do pretty well because they may be able to get overtime. I'm thinking of the garbage workers in the city of Toronto last time. They had a pile of overtime that surpassed whatever they lost in wages. But others, they can't, like daycare workers. They're not going to get any of that money back because that time is gone. And conversely, the garbage workers, half the city actually went to the non-union sector. So it was farmed out. So that kind of impacted the garbage workers. Oh, the last point, unionization is on average associated with lower profits, and that's from the corporate perspective. So they feel that they're impacted overall with lower profits. So that's why some companies will fight tooth and nail to avoid unions. Some companies take a more proactive approach. So most of the Japanese automotive manufacturers that have plants in Canada or in the US, they're non-union. So how is that possible when the big three, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, they're all unionized? Yet, Honda comes into Ontario and it's not unionized. Well, they pay very similar wages. They have really good benefit programs. They make sure that there's a mechanism for the employees to grieve. Therefore, they don't have the unions. If I'm an employee, why do I want to pay union dues if I don't have to pay union dues? Why do I want to worry about a strike if I don't have to worry about a strike? And my employer's given me very close, probably a little bit less, but very close to what I would get in the unionized sector. I'd be kind of shooting myself in the foot there. So they're able to do that by almost matching what the unionized sector is doing. And they can afford to do it. Unions and that gives them more latitude, more control too, to implement things. So collective action, collective punishment, free riding. Well, there's that aspect that you have to worry about with unions. Free riding is the aspect. Well, I'm protected by the union. I'm going to take it easy. I'm not going to do that bit of work. There's I remember one of the students when I did my MBA, and we had a group, and we had one person in the group that didn't do any work, and I forget what language he spoke, but I asked him, he kept mumbling something to himself, and I said, "What are you saying?" He goes, "Spare tire. That person's a spare tire. Everywhere we go, we have to take the spare tire with us, but we never use it." So it's free riding is somebody that's the spare tire without the real use to it. Spare tires sometimes they can come in handy. The utilization of dispute resolution. So definitely there is a process in place to be able to work out disputes. Balanced bilateral relationships, give and take, reciprocity. I help you, you help me. So there's a lot of that goes on with unions. And even if there's a national agreement, maybe there's a local agreement that just between that plant and the employees that we'll do this if you do that. And they're both in agreement. So they can work around the overall superseding agreement. Giving protection against big stakes. That's where you got to be a little bit careful is if you, as a corporation, agree to a contract during boom times that you haven't really tied your hands in a future recession. Agreements get broken. Usually it takes like the company to be close to bankruptcy before a union's going to agree to breaking the collective agreement. But if they see that the company's going to go under and all the members are going to lose their jobs, if they're smart, they will concede and renegotiate at that point. So what I'd like you to do before the synchronous class is, read these questions over and think about what we've been discussing here. And I'd write down for you, because everybody's from different backgrounds and different areas. And some people have worked in unionized environments. Some of you already are currently working in a unionized environment. Things that were of interest to you, things that you did not really fully understand prior to this. Do a little bit more digging on those topics. We can discuss them in the synchronous part of the class. And what key takeaways did you get? I'd make some notes on that just to help the material stick. And then we'll talk about that when we get into the lecture, the synchronous lecture. So I hope you have a wonderful day. And again, I'm Tom Stevenson signing off for now, and we'll see you soon. Okay, bye for now.